A warm welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. The second U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit has ended in Washington, D.C., and to some analysts I've spoken to, the U.S. renewed interest on the continent will build African confidence in American investment for many countries. President Joe Biden announced support for the African Union to join the G20 group of developing economies and a whopping $55 billion for clean energy and digital and technological innovation. What does Africa make of the summit, and has it been a win-win? I'll be talking to Nigeria's Ambassador to Burundi, Elijah Onyeagba, on what these promises might mean for Nigeria and his host country, Burundi. All that in a moment. First, a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles.
U.S. President Joe Biden commended President Muhammadu Buhari for his efforts at deepening democracy in Nigeria and in Africa. This came as both leaders met on the sidelines of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. President Biden also encouraged his Nigerian counterpart and the nation's electoral umpire, INEC, to remain totally non-partisan as the general elections approach. A statement by President Buhari's senior special advisor, Garba Shehu, said President Biden expressed understanding of the current challenges faced by Nigerians and indicated willingness of the U.S. to offer support. South Korea's military says the North fired 2 ballistic missiles towards the Korean peninsula's east coast. The launch comes just days after the country tested a high-thrust solid-fuel engine that experts say will allow quicker and more mobile launch of ballistic missiles as it seeks to develop new strategic weapon and speed up its nuclear and missile programs. The test was conducted on Thursday, December the 15th, at North Korea's Sohae satellite launching ground, which has been used to test missile technologies, including rocket engines and space vehicles. On Sunday, Japan launched a strong protest against North Korea. The country's Vice Defense Minister Toshiro Ino said North Korea has conducted an unprecedented number of missile tests this year, including an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of reaching the U.S. mainland despite international bans and sanctions. Finally, European Union negotiators have reached a political deal to overhaul the bloc's carbon market, cutting planet heating emissions faster and imposing new CO2 costs on fuels used in road transport and buildings from 2027. The EU carbon market requires around 10,000 power plants and factories to buy CO2 permits when they pollute a system central to meeting the EU's target to cut its net emissions 55% by 2030 compared with 1990 levels. Under the deal agreed by negotiators from EU countries and the European Parliament, the EU carbon market will be reformed to cut emissions by 62% from 2005 levels by 2030.
It was 3 days of talks, bilaterals, and more talks. What did leaders really talk about during the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit? Maybe this report can explain.
Democratic Republic of Congo.
Leaders of the 49 African countries invited by U.S. President Joe Biden to attend the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C., posed for a family photo marking the end of the 3-day summit. President Biden had earlier announced he would support the African Union joining the G20 groups of large economies as a permanent member, part of Washington's efforts at reinvigorating ties with the continent. He also said the U.S. was looking to increase collaboration in all areas with countries on the continent.
The United States is all in on Africa's future. And the work we've done over the past 2 years, building on decades of vital investments made under previous American presidents, has helped make possible the critical steps that I'm about to announce. Because when Africa succeeds, the United States succeeds. Quite frankly, the whole world succeeds as well.
He said a new U.S. agreement with the African Continental Free Trade Area will give American companies access to 1.3 billion people and a market valued at $3.4 trillion.
We're finally implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area. It will represent one of the largest free trade areas in the world, 1.3 billion people, and a continent-wide market totaling $3.4 trillion. And with the new MOU, we're doing things correctly, enshrining protection for workers, both across Africa and in the United States. And we also know that the G7 meeting earlier this year, we announced our intention to collectively mobilize $600 billion in the next 5 years.
Then he announced millions of dollars in international development finance.
Today, I'm announcing that the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation is investing nearly $370 million in new projects, $100 million to increase the reliable, clean energy for millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, $20 million to provide financing for fertilizer to help smallholder farmers, particularly women farmers, increase the yields of their crops, $10 million to support small and medium-sized enterprises that help bring clean drinking water to communities all across the continent.
Leaders attended dinner hosted at the White House on Wednesday, where President Biden addressed what he called America's original sin, the enslavement of millions of people, and honored their descendants and the broader Africa diaspora community in the United States.
And to the promise and potential of our partnership. Hear, hear.
He shared a toast with Senegalese President Macky Sall, who's also chairperson of the Africa Union, who was also pleased the U.S. wanted to take its relations with Africa to the next level.
We share the same spirit. We want to advance our common agenda with you and take our partnership to the next level in an inclusive approach, bringing together governments, the private sector, civil society, and the African diaspora.
Some analysts criticized the summit, saying the U.S. stance was all talk and no action. Another described it as an attempt by America to restore its credibility.
The conference in Washington that is to be held by President Biden is a desperate attempt by the government of the United States of America and by the military to restore credibility for the U.S. Africa Command and the efforts of the United States to give meaning to its strategy for sub-Saharan Africa. The global African constituency, especially African descendants in the United States, are completely opposed to this framing of Africa.
We look back at Libya and the intervention of America, which was not that positive. We look back at many other crises in Africa that the USA has not necessarily played a positive and leading role. So what we have seen over the past, of course, is that there has been so much of talk and no action. And what is needed now is a coherent mechanism in terms of timelines, in terms of funding, in terms of systems that needs to be put in place.
President of the Africa Policy Institute in Kenya, Peter Kagwanjum, says the U.S. hopes to become a hegemonic leader in Africa through the summit.
You want to still be a hegemonic leader of Africa. So let the summit not be a platform for pushing down the throats of the African people. What we need are partnerships that help Africa to develop and that recognize the continent as a legitimate child of this planet, and that we are and have the right to develop. We want to have mutual relationship with others, not hegemonic relationships. The relationship between China and Africa is not just a touch and go. It is systematic, it is well thought out, it is based on the principles of equality. So if the summit does not include in it, as its agenda, primary agenda, industrialization of the continent, at whatever level, manufacturing, processing of foods and so on, then it is as useless as anything. We can call it a big party. Or do you want a cocktail of leaders?
China, Africa's long-standing partner, and whom many countries believe may have been the drive for renewed U.S. partnerships with the continent, reacted at the start of the summit in Washington, saying that the wishes of African countries and people to choose cooperation partners should be respected, as they're in the best position to say what is good for them. Bin said China is always happy to see diversity of Africa's cooperation partnerships and welcomes the international community, including the United States, to pay more attention and invest more in Africa and carry out truly equal and mutually beneficial cooperation with Africa. I want to bring in Nigerian Ambassador to Burundi, Ambassador Elijah Onyeagba, to discuss the outcome of the summit and other issues. Ambassador Onyeagba joins me from our studios in Abuja. Thank you for joining me on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you so very much, Amarachi. It's my pleasure.
Now, much of this summit between the U.S. and African leaders were mainly about investments and financial support. As one coming from such a background before becoming ambassador, what did you make of the summit and the outcome?
Thank you very much. You know, the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, it's happening 8 years after the first edition, which happened under President Obama. Unfortunately, President Trump didn't do much with U.S.-Africa leadership, or with the U.S. and Africa Leadership Summit. But incidentally, the President Biden, has found it worthy to go back to where President Obama stopped, which was to begin to look at Africa, because this summit is about the prism through which the United States sees Africa. And of course, you can argue that this is also coming from the point of view that a whole lot is going on in the international space, where countries like China is beginning to have overreaching influence in the continent. So this is about trying to, the U.S. trying to show that they are a power, that they are power within, within the world, trying to demonstrate that leadership by way of supporting Africa in most of the things that Africa is going through at the moment. And of course, within that period, the 3-day summit, you will agree with me that it covers very important areas such as the understanding of the forum that has to do with the young African leaders in diaspora. This young group of people are doing well in the U.S., and of course, they are also trying to come back and do and assist the leadership, within the various countries in the continent. There was also a forum of, that was focused on the civil society. The civil society forum obviously had the connection with the African Union 2063 agenda. And that agenda had a lot to do with the civil society, talking about peace and security, talking about democracy in Africa, talking about having an Africa where the digital economy is very active. And also, if you also go further down, there was also the US-Africa Space Forum. And the most important of all is the US Business Forum, US-Africa Business Forum, where there was a deal room that was actually announcing deals that were coming up. Of course, you talked about the funding. There was an announcement of about $55 billion investment in Africa. That covers the area of health, covers infrastructure. Of a particular specific is the infrastructure on the Niger Republic corridor. So there are so many positives that came after, that came as a result of this summit. And I can tell you that the U.S. has demonstrated that they are no longer sitting down and waiting for countries like China to take the lead in the relations with Africa. And I think it's a step in the right direction for the United States and, of course, all the leaders of the African continents.
Now, as a diplomat, did you have any expectations for the summit?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's important at this point in the U.S.-Africa relations to begin to streamline things. Even though we know that nothing is free in the international arena, everything, even the aid is not free. But it's important that between the U.S. and African leaders that they sit down on the table to begin to look at very many ways of collaboration. Because as far as Africa is concerned, I believe that the attitude at this point in time should be that of collaboration, not that of give me, give me, give me. So to that extent, I had high expectation, and I believe that to a large extent, my expectations were met, because quite a lot of, I think about 55 African leaders, presidents were there at the forum, which is the first step. The next step again is that the US also in turn, they were there with the presidents making keynote addresses, and quite a lot of areas or the trade communities like the ECOWAS, the COMESA, the SADC, Southern Africa, the East African community were also represented. You also will agree with me that Africa's population is expected to double by 2050. And to that extent, with the introduction of AfTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, we are about to have the largest single market in the world. And to that extent, it is not a market that anybody can neglect, not China, not the US.
Let's talk about the Nigerian delegation at the summit, because you've talked about all of these deals that took place in Washington, but we just heard very little about what Nigeria was doing at the summit. I'll give you one instance. President Buhari made a case for Nigeria's plan for renewable energy, and then the NASA Artemis Accord. Did we really get what we wanted from the summit? And, what could have been our expectations going there?
Oh, thank you very much, Amarachi. If you ask me, I will tell you that on the 13th of December, I think, the Minister for Communication, Issa Pantami, on behalf of the government of Nigeria, and of course, his counterpart, Francis Ngabo of Rwanda, became signatories to the NASA agreement, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Yeah. Yes, the Artemis Accord. What this means is that as a leader in the continent, there were actually 21 countries that were there before. This is about how we can look at the capabilities of the outer space and take maximum advantage of that to help support the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals. And I believe that as a leader in the continent, Nigeria should be at the table where these issues are being discussed. Nigeria should also lead the continent, where these discussions are being held, so that we can, this is about having best practices in the outer space. This is about whatever that happens there, we need to be at the decision table. We need to be at the room where these things are being discussed. So I'm very, very happy that we signed on to that agreement. I'm quite certain that with time, we're probably going to have, NASA as one of the accreditations for Nigerian ambassadors. I'm quite sure that's going to happen, so that we can actually be in that space. Whatever the world is gaining from being in that space, I think Nigeria is in a good position to be able to do that. Not just Nigeria, I think even Rwanda as a country have also joined. I think we became the 22nd or the 23rd country that joined, in that NASA agreement. So I'm quite happy. You can see that the president also made a speech on renewable energy, and in addition to that, also assured the world that the handover of 2023 after the election is sacrosanct, which is also one of the things that the whole world is looking up to Nigeria. You know that there was also another session that the US president held with quite a lot of countries that are going to be having transition between now and the next 1 year. Nigeria was also there to assure the US and, of course, the world that there is going to be a peaceful handover of power. So overall, I think that we are in a good position as an outcome of the summit.
Yes, but did we really have expectations going to this summit? And what do you think those expectations were? Because you find a lot of conversations, the side of the conversations coming from the United side of the United States, what the U.S. will be doing, what the U.S. expects, to do in Africa, all of these monies and all these investments going into Africa, but not much from the African leaders themselves. It just seems like many of them came there to listen.
Without a doubt, I support the idea that we must sit down and engage. First, being in the meeting is the starting point. But being able to articulate what your expectations are. For example, I'm quite certain that a lot of these countries, Nigeria actually prepared to be at that event to sign the Artemis agreement. And I'm sure they were happy with what happened in that regard. And for some of the support that are coming as a result of this summit, particularly in the digital economy, in health, and of course in the, we are also part of the countries that participated in the AGOA Trade Ministerial as well. So I'm very certain that we are in a good position as a country. But clearly, I hear you loud and clear that a lot of African leaders must rise up to the challenge of having a clear expectation and then sitting down and saying, listen, we do not want A, we want B. We do not think that C is going to work. And I think that that is the level where the leadership of Africa is expected to rise to. The citizens of Africa are looking forward to their leaders to go ahead and look at the, look at the people we're engaging with eyeball to eyeball, be able to say yes on some, on certain instances, and be able to say no when certain things are being offered. We already know the implication of the aids that come to Africa and how these aids go. So to that extent, I understand that, but I think that we are mature to the level where we can begin to take certain things within our control without allowing them to lord over us in so many other areas.
Now, some people think that this summit was probably at the instance of China's influence on Africa, and I know that the U.S. president tried to debunk that. The Chinese government, however, released a statement, addressed the press at the beginning of the summit, saying that it's open, to Africa should have other partnerships, but other partnerships should be working for Africa's own benefit. And when you hear China say that, it's hard to believe that, the U.S. is competing with China on the continent, although the U.S. says, no, they're not competing. But do you really think there is competition here? Because it seems like, Africa has a better deal with China than with the West.
I totally agree with you at this point. The truth of the matter is that whether we like it or not, the United States, I believe, is worried with what China is doing in the African continent. Like I mentioned earlier, the trade between China and Africa is about 70%, much better than any other country in the world. And I believe that what the U.S. is also doing, whether they accept it or not, is a direct response to what China is doing with the continent of Africa. And of course, I have nothing wrong with their own response. As much as they say they are not competing, a lot of people will look at it from the other side and say that that's not true. Everybody wants a cake, wants a pie from the African continent. We are not very bothered as to whether they are competing or not. I think what is important at this point is for the leaders of the continent to have an agenda clearly, whether it's the US, whether it's Russia, whether it's the Europe, whether it's China. We care less who it is. The most important thing is to go to the negotiation table with all the cards on the table, to be able to have the ability to say yes to certain deals, say no to certain deals. I think that's what Africa should concern itself with.
Indeed, and Africa is in the best position to pick and choose, which partners it wants at this time, being the bride right now. You sound like you would have loved to have been in the room, where these deals were being made and to have these discussions. But let's talk about where you do have some influence, and that's in Burundi, where you are ambassador. You've had a busy year. The last time we spoke, it was almost like you were given an invitation, an open invitation to Nigerians to come to Burundi. Thankfully, the visa process is a lot easier now. And then I understand the First Lady of Nigeria was there just a couple of months ago. You want to talk about her visit and how that impacted on, your work in Burundi?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Amarachi. The last time we spoke, I extended a lot of invitations to Nigerian business community to visit Burundi. In addition to some of the bilateral agreements that we have signed between Nigeria and Burundi, we have held the maiden edition of the Nigeria-Burundi Business Summit sometime 2 months ago. And in that summit, we brought together players in some sectors, agricultural sector, entertainment sector, fashion and design. We brought everybody in a room to look at each other and find areas of collaboration. And, it was the first of its kind. It has never happened, in the history of the Nigeria-Burundi relations. And it was a very important occasion that Nigerians attended across all sectors. And the president of Burundi was on ground to open the summit. And it was a beautiful event. And we found businesses that had partnership, that signed even memorandum of understanding. As I speak to you at the moment, quite a lot of companies from Nigeria are registered in Burundi and doing business in Burundi. There's even a Nigerian-owned university today that is in Burundi. And a lot of Burundians are now trying to do business with Nigerians. As an outcome of the summit, we have a company in Nigeria that is supplying fertilizer raw materials, urea and DAP to companies in Burundi to the tune of about $20 million or thereabout. So these are some of the things that we're doing. And as a follow-up to that, the First Lady of Nigeria was in Burundi. She is the president of the Africa First Ladies Peace Mission. And the vice president of the wife of the president of Burundi, Her Excellency Angeline Ndayishimiye. So she extended invitation to the First Lady of Nigeria, and the event was about a high-level meeting between Africa First Ladies discussing malnutrition in Africa. And the First Lady was there, made promises, have also fulfilled those promises. So at this point in time, the Burundians were very happy receiving the First Lady of Nigeria. And I can tell you that we have improved on the relations between Nigeria and Burundi. And that visit has further strengthened the ties between Nigeria and Burundi. So we are doing a lot, and we are hoping that all of the things we've done now will give more way for more Nigerian businesses to come to Burundi and vice versa.
Ambassador Elijah Onyeagba, thank you so much for speaking with me on Diplomatic Channel. I suppose you have about a year or so to go in your tenureship in Burundi. We look forward to your further diplomatic progress, either a repeat, an extension of your stay in Burundi, or you being transferred somewhere else. But either way, we'll keep tabs on your progress, and we wish you well. Thank you again.
Thank you so very much, Amarachi. God bless you.
As we come to the end of the program, I'd like to extend our condolences to the family of Ambassador Demola Seriki, Nigeria's ambassador to Spain, who died late last week and was buried here in Nigeria over the weekend. Ambassador Seriki was a politician before taking on diplomatic service as Nigerian ambassador to the Kingdom of Spain, with concurrent accreditation as a permanent representative of Nigeria to the United Nations World Tourism Organization, following his appointment by President Muhammadu Buhari in January 2021. Our thoughts and prayers are with the family at this time. And this is where we end the program this week. Don't forget, you can watch episodes of Diplomatic Channel online. Just go to youtube.com/channelsweb, search for Diplomatic Channel, and keep those comments coming. I'm Amarachi Ubani. You can reach me on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. I'll see you next time.